Now that you have a conditioned marker and you have your dog's focus and attention, let's begin with sit. As easy as it seems and as common as it is taught, most dogs really don't understand what sit means. Does your dog sit the first time? Do they sit in any context, such as beside you, behind you, at a distance, in all environments, even with distractions? The main reason that most cues are not fully understood is because most people introduce the cue before the dog understands the behavior itself. For example, when you say sit, when the dog is not sitting, which then eventually turns into you saying sit multiple times or resorting to pulling up on the leash and or pushing the dog's back end down and basically annoying the dog. It is our nature to want to speak our words and language, but dogs have no idea what our words mean, at least until we show them. So, with that in mind, we are going to use luring to begin teaching your dog what sit really means. In the process of teaching sit, we are also going to introduce a release word or phrase that tells your dog that they can now move out of the sit position. It doesn't matter what your release cue is. I use free. Other people use break, or still others use release. Whatever makes sense to you. Choose something that makes sense to you. The release word is very important here. Also, if you feel like you need a leash to keep your dog with you to begin, go ahead and attach a leash and have plenty of high-value treats available that you discover that your dog really likes. The first step in the training is as follows. Holding the treat at your dog's nose, like a magnet, move upward and back. Keep the treat at your dog's nose level. If you hold the treat too high, your dog will be tempted to lift their feet off the ground. The up and back motion encourages the dog's head and neck to move back, and that will move your dog's bottom toward the ground. Let your dog lick and nibble at the treat. As soon as their bottom touches the ground, use your verbal marker, such as yes, and then let them have half of the treat. Then quickly, before your dog gets up and out of the sit position on their own, I want you to release them by taking the other half of that treat and luring them into a standing position. In the beginning, we are not saying the verbal cue sit. Remember, we want the dog to get the concept and fully understand the behavior before we use the word that is going to tell the dog what we want. Repeat this until your dog is offering the sit readily.
Did you want to use the other thing? Probably not. All right.
Once your dog is offering the sit readily, you will then want to move your hand in the same movement as when you were holding the treat, but empty-handed. Did he or she sit? If so, reward heavily. If not, repeat until you can simply give the hand signal without the treat.
puppy. Free. Yes, good girl. Free. Good puppy.
Once your dog is sitting with just the hand signal, you are ready to add your verbal cue. When you are 99.9% certain that your dog is going to go into the sit position, say sit. If for some reason the dog doesn't sit, avoid saying sit again. We don't want your sit cue to turn into saying sit multiple times. Just try again, and when they are in motion and their rear is about to touch the ground, say the cue and reward.
Sit. Yes, good girl. Free. Sit. Yes. Free. Sit. Good girl. Free. Sit. Free. Sit. Yes. Free. Sit. Yes. Free. Sit. Yes. Good girl. Sit. Yay, puppy. Free. Yes. Sit. Yes. Free. Sit. Free.
You should practice these techniques in all contexts. Practice having your dog sit in all areas of your home. Take it to your yard, then take it to more distracting areas. Remember, dogs don't generalize, so be prepared to take a few steps back if necessary. If your dog is struggling, it's perfectly fine to use the treat lure again. They will remember quickly. One thing to remember in this part of your training is to get rid of that food lure as soon as possible. I don't want you to have to rely on having a cookie in your hand to get your dog to listen to you. Once they are getting this, ask them to sit, release, and ask them to sit again, and then reward and release. You can start asking them to sit and reward after they sit the third time, or then reward on the fifth time, and then reward on the first time again. Vary your reinforcement so that your dog doesn't learn to expect a treat every time you ask them to sit. You can praise them and then ask for it again and reward. Using variable reinforcement is very powerful. Adding in the maybe factor will help your dog to keep trying. Do not ever stop rewarding your dog completely. To keep a behavior strong, it needs to be reinforced. But once the behavior is understood and learned, there is no reason to reward every time they do it. Once you have the sit consistent and reliable on verbal cue, you no longer need to mark it. Your marker, whatever it may be, is for training only. Once the behavior is learned, using good or other types of verbal praise is perfect. Now we will be moving on to impulse control and leave it. Just like us, dogs want what they want, and they want it now. It's up to us to teach them that waiting patiently will be more productive and more likely to get them what they want than lunging and jumping will be. This also requires the handler's patience and willingness to work through the process. A good example of this is when you are ready to take your dog for a walk. You grab the leash and head to the door. As soon as you grab the leash, your dog goes crazy, jumping, barking, and crazy with excitement. If you proceed with your dog in this state, struggling to snap the leash on and then open the door for your dog to barge out ahead of you, their crazy behavior has been reinforced and is likely to continue, if not become even worse. But if you pick up your leash and the moment your dog begins the craziness, you calmly set the leash back down and wait for him to settle down. Then pick up the leash again and repeat this process until you can put the leash on with your dog calmly sitting until you are ready to open the door. Your dog has learned that sitting calmly gets them what they want much faster. Yes, at first it is going to take longer for you to go on your walk, but the next time, the process will take less time, and eventually you will have a dog that understands that they have control over how fast the walk will begin and be much more willing to sit calmly. Sit down. Sit down. Thank you. Sit down. Sit down. Another example of impulse control is when you put your hand on the door to open it. Does your dog claw at the door and push to go out? Stop. Do not proceed. Rather, put your hand on the doorknob. If your dog gets up or gets pushy to go out, take your hand off the doorknob and wait for them to be calm. Put your hand on the doorknob and turn it. If your dog gets up, you take your hand off the doorknob again. When they are calm with you putting your hand on the doorknob and turning it, then you can proceed to opening the door. If they get up, the door shuts and your hand comes off the doorknob. You repeat this process until they are successful with staying calm throughout this entire sequence. During this process, you should not be saying anything at all. We want the dog to make the choices on their own. Your hand on the doorknob is reinforcement. Your hand off the doorknob removes the opportunity for reinforcement. They understand this much better than our words. They begin to understand that their behavior has consequences and that controlling their behavior is valuable. This is another example of impulse control. Proceeding out of the door and loose leash walking is another step in the process and will be covered in another lesson. Now that we have covered some impulse control situations, it is time to move on to leave it. And having a verbal cue to tell your dog to move away from something, to leave it, is very important and can be life-saving. Teaching this cue is much like the door training, but we will be using high-value treats as our reinforcement. To train this cue, you will play a game with your dog. I prefer to sit on the ground or on the floor, but if you have trouble sitting on the ground, you can always use your hand to teach this while you are standing. The first step in this game will be to have a treat in your open palm or on the ground with your hand ready to cover it. The moment your dog goes for the treat, you will cover the treat or close your hand. Chances are your dog is going to continue licking, nibbling, and maybe even pawing your hand in attempts to get at the food. Keep it covered until they stop for a second and then quickly open or uncover the treat. You will have to be quick here because they will usually go back to trying it again. This is a good thing. This is what you want. You want them to keep trying. If you are using your closed hand instead of covering the treat on the ground, be sure to keep your arms still. Only your hand closes. You don't want to pull your arm back or move it at all. All that you need to do is close your hand. Every time they stop mugging your hand, open it. If you are covering the treat on the ground, when they stop showing interest, uncover the treat briefly and cover it back up when they come back to it. At this point, we aren't saying anything to the dog. We are letting them work it out, the same way they did with putting on the leash for the walk. They mug your hand, you cover the treat. They move away, and the food reappears. What we are looking for in this game is a moment when the dog offers something other than licking, nibbling, pawing, or mugging your hand. Some dogs will stop, sit, and stare at the food in either your open hand or uncovered on the floor. Some will lie down. We are looking for that pause. When this happens, be ready to reward with another piece of the same high-value treat from the other hand. Keep the original uncovered. After they eat the treat you rewarded with, they will generally go back to the treat on the ground or in your open palm. Cover it and start again. This time it is not going to take as long for your dog to figure it out. When they pause again, reward from the other hand again. Eventually, you should be able to keep the treat in your open hand or on the ground and even pick a small part from that treat while your dog sits patiently waiting for you to give the piece to them. It usually doesn't take long for them to catch on to this game. Once they understand the concept, you can begin adding your verbal cue, leave it. Again, the cue you use is yours to choose. It doesn't matter what you use to tell your dog to leave something alone. I use leave it because it makes sense to me. If you will add your cue when your dog is consistent in leaving it alone and in the act of leaving it, just say the cue once. You can build your own criteria as it suits you. Once they are succeeding with leaving it on the ground or in your hand, you can move to working with them on a leash with something on the ground. Once you are successful playing this game with a treat in your hand, you can move to standing up and using your foot to cover the treat in the same way that you used your hand to cover it. This way, they begin to generalize and understand that the rules are still the same as when you were sitting down and using your hand. When you introduce this on the leash, help your dog to be successful by putting something on the ground that is not quite as high value as what you were using in the training process. You want them to show interest in whatever you use, but you also want them to be able to control themselves enough in these beginning stages on leash to be able to move away from whatever you are using. When they notice the object on the ground, give your cue once. The minute they move away or look towards you, mark and reward heavily. One thing that you want to avoid doing is jerking on the leash and repeating your cue. If you pull on the leash, you are relying on that instead of your verbal cue. There may be a time when you don't have a leash to pull on. Build your cue to mean what it is meant for. Say it once and wait for them to respond to it. Practice this with different things and in different environments and situations to keep it strong. This fundamental training will be important in the later stages of this program. You will need a dog that is under control and willing to wait for instruction from you.
Yes, good. Yes. Yes, very good. Very good. Good girl. Good job, puppy. Good girl.
Hi, this is Jill Powell, co-founder of Remnant Canine 360 with your dog fun facts for today. We've been learning a lot of fun things about man's best friend. Did you know that big, happy helicopter tail wagging is one sign of a really nice dog? Upright, stiff, rapid tail movement is not wagging or friendly, but indicates a dog who's rather excited and focused. Did you know that puppies grow to half their body weight in the first 4 to 5 months? And they also can sleep 18 to 20 hours a day during that rapid body growth phase. Dogs sometimes appear to smile, much like humans, with an open mouth grinning. This may indicate a relaxed, submissive state. Tired puppies get cranky just like little kids. If you have a fussy puppy, maybe try some nap time. There are about 400 million dogs in the world. The average dog lives 10 to 14 years, and in general, smaller breeds live longer than larger breeds. We hope you've enjoyed your dog fun facts for today and keep on training.